The morning commute. The city had just begun to stir. Naomi Carter stood at the bus stop clutching her medical bag, her fingers tightening around its handle as she adjusted her scarf against the brisk morning air. The soft hum of distant traffic filled the air, mingling with the rhythmic chirp of birds. Naomi's shift at the hospital began in less than an hour, and today was particularly significant. She was scheduled to lead a rare and complex surgery, a procedure she had spent months preparing for. She checked her watch and exhaled, a misty puff in the cold. The bus was late. Normally, this would not rattle her, but today was different. Every minute counted. When the bus arrived, its engine growling as it slowed to a halt, Naomi stepped forward. The doors wheezed open, and she was greeted by the driver, a burly, middle-aged man with salt and pepper stubble and a permanent scowl etched across his face. His name tag read, W. Harris. Naomi offered a polite nod as she reached for her fare card. But the driver's eyes didn't meet hers. Instead, they swept over her with a look that made her stomach churn. His gaze lingered, cold and unwelcoming, as if trying to find fault in her very presence. "Not today," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Naomi to hear. She froze, her card halfway to the scanner. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "I said, not today," the man repeated, louder this time. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing. "This bus is full." Naomi glanced at the rows of seats behind him. Nearly all were empty. A mother sat near the front with her child on her lap, and a man in a business suit tapped on his phone toward the rear. The rest of the bus was barren. "It doesn't look full to me," Naomi said, her brow furrowing. The driver's lips curled into a smirk. "I make the rules here. Take the next one." Naomi felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Sir, I'm a paying passenger. You have no right to deny me service." "I said, take the next bus," he snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. The passengers stirred but remained silent, their eyes darting between Naomi and the driver. The mother glanced down at her child, as if pretending not to notice. The man in the suit shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Their apathy stung almost as much as the driver's words. Naomi straightened her back, her resolve hardening. "I have every right to board this bus," she said, her voice steady. "You can either let me on, or I can call the transit authority and file a formal complaint." The driver's smirk disappeared. He leaned forward, his face inches from hers. "You think you can threaten me?" he growled. "Fine. Get on." Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The venom in his tone made it clear this was far from over. Naomi stepped aboard, scanning her card. As she walked past him, he muttered something under his breath that she didn't quite catch. It didn't matter. She wouldn't let him ruin her day. She chose a seat near the middle, close enough to the other passengers to feel a semblance of safety but far enough to avoid drawing further attention. The bus lurched forward, the sudden motion jolting her in her seat. She glanced out the window, trying to focus on the passing scenery, but her mind was clouded with unease. The bus rattled along its route, stopping intermittently to pick up and drop off passengers. Each time, Naomi felt the driver's gaze flicker toward her in the rearview mirror, his expression dark and unreadable. She tried to ignore it, but the tension in the air was palpable. A few blocks later, the bus came to an abrupt stop, causing Naomi to clutch the seat in front of her for balance. The driver stood from his seat and turned to face the passengers. "Everyone off," he barked. The passengers exchanged confused glances. "What?" one man asked. "I said, get off the bus," the driver repeated, his voice rising. "This bus is out of service." Naomi's heart sank. She knew this was directed at her, though he disguised it as a general announcement. The passengers grumbled as they gathered their belongings, shuffling toward the exit. Naomi stayed seated, her jaw tightening. "You too," the driver said, glaring at her. "Off." Naomi stood slowly, her eyes locking with his. "This is harassment," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "You can't treat people like this." "I can do whatever I want," he shot back. "Now get off my bus." Naomi's fists clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to remain calm. She walked to the door, stepping onto the pavement. The other passengers dispersed, muttering among themselves. The bus doors hissed shut, and the driver revved the engine before pulling away, leaving Naomi standing on the sidewalk. She watched the bus disappear down the street, her chest tightening with frustration and disbelief. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a blatant act of discrimination. Naomi had spent her entire life fighting against barriers like this, proving time and time again that she was more than the color of her skin. But moments like this reminded her how far society still had to go. Determined not to let this incident define her day, Naomi pulled out her phone and called a rideshare. She would get to the hospital on time, no matter what. As she waited for the car to arrive, she began documenting the incident, typing every detail into her phone while it was still fresh in her mind. This wasn't over. Naomi knew she had to act, not just for herself but for anyone who might face the same treatment. She had spent her career saving lives and standing up for what was right. Today would be no different. As the rideshare pulled up, Naomi took a deep breath and stepped inside. She had patients to care for and a battle to fight. And she wasn't backing down. The ripple effect. Naomi arrived at the hospital 15 minutes later than usual, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She entered through the emergency room doors, the sterile smell of disinfectant mixing with the low hum of activity. Nurses bustled past, and the intercom crackled intermittently with updates. Naomi adjusted her lab coat, her movements precise despite the turmoil inside her. She couldn't afford to let the morning's events distract her from her patients. Her first surgery was a triple bypass, a delicate procedure requiring intense focus and steady hands. As she scrubbed in, her mind forced itself into professional mode. She mentally reviewed the patient's medical history, running through the steps of the operation. By the time she stepped into the operating room, she had locked her emotions away, storing them in the recesses of her mind for later. The surgery went flawlessly. Hours later, Naomi stood at the sink, washing the remnants of the procedure off her hands. The operating room team exchanged satisfied nods, a silent acknowledgement of a job well done. Naomi let herself exhale, a small victory in a day that had started so poorly. But the moment of relief was fleeting. As she returned to her office, her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. It was a link to a social media post, a grainy video taken by one of the bus passengers that morning. Naomi's stomach dropped as she opened the video. In the clip, the bus driver's voice was unmistakable. His tone was sharp, laced with the same venom Naomi had endured. "You're not getting on my bus," he said, his words clear over the murmur of other passengers. The video didn't capture the entirety of the encounter, but it was enough to show his hostility. Naomi's hands shook as she read the caption beneath the video, "This happened on Route 45 today." Unbelievable. Within minutes, the video had amassed hundreds of comments. Some expressed outrage, while others questioned Naomi's actions, falling into the same trap of victim blaming that she had feared. Her name wasn't mentioned, but anyone who knew her could recognize her in the footage. A knock at her office door broke her focus. It was Dr. Patel, one of her closest colleagues. "Naomi, have you seen this?" he asked, holding up his phone with the video open. She nodded, her throat tightening. "Yeah. I just saw it." Dr. Patel's expression was a mix of concern and anger. "This is unacceptable. Are you okay?" Naomi hesitated, unsure how to respond. She had spent years perfecting the art of composure, of never letting anyone see her pain. But today, that mask felt impossibly heavy. "I'll be fine," she said finally, her voice even. "I'm more worried about what happens next." Things like this don't always end in justice. Dr. Patel's eyes narrowed. Then we make sure it does. You're not alone in this, Naomi. If you want to pursue action, I'll support you. Her heart warmed at his words, but doubt still gnawed at her. She thanked him and returned to her desk, staring at the screen of her phone. The comments continued to pour in, a chaotic mix of support and vitriol. Hours later, as the day wound down, Naomi received a call from the transit authority. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Carla, who identified herself as a senior investigator. Dr. Carter, we've received multiple complaints about an incident involving one of our drivers this morning. I'd like to discuss it with you, if you're willing. Naomi's pulse quickened. I'm willing, she said, keeping her tone steady. What do you need from me? Carla explained the process. Naomi would need to provide a detailed statement, which would be reviewed alongside the video and any other evidence. The driver, Harris, had already been suspended pending the investigation. Naomi agreed to meet with Carla the next day. As she hung up the phone, a wave of relief washed over her. For the first time that day, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be swept under the rug. Maybe she could turn her pain into progress. That evening, Naomi sat in her apartment, replaying the video and reading the comments. The support she received from strangers lifted her spirits, but the hateful comments stung. Some accused her of overreacting, while others dismissed her entirely, claiming the driver had simply been having a bad day. She couldn't let those voices deter her. Naomi pulled out a notebook and began jotting down her thoughts. She detailed every moment of the encounter, every word the driver had said, and every emotion she had felt. She didn't want to forget a single detail. As she wrote, her determination solidified. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or mistreated because of prejudice. She had spent her career fighting for others, saving lives in the operating room. Now, she would fight for herself, and for anyone else who had faced the same kind of injustice. The next morning, Naomi walked into the transit authority's office with her head held high. Carla greeted her warmly and led her to a conference room. Naomi recounted the incident in painstaking detail, her voice unwavering. Carla listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. When the meeting ended, Carla extended a hand. Thank you for coming forward, Dr. Carter. We'll do everything we can to ensure this is handled appropriately. Naomi shook her hand firmly. I appreciate that. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. As Naomi left the building, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The fight was far from over, but she had taken the first step. She wasn't just a victim, she was an advocate, a voice for change. And she wasn't backing down. Gathering strength. The days following Naomi's meeting with the transit authority were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. Though the weight of the incident still bore down on her, she found herself galvanized by the outpouring of support from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. Dr. Patel had been true to his word, rallying their colleagues to stand behind Naomi in her fight for justice. Messages of solidarity came flooding in from the hospital staff, with many expressing outrage over what had happened. Naomi's story began to gain traction beyond the hospital walls. The viral video had been picked up by local news outlets, and reporters began reaching out to her for interviews. At first, Naomi hesitated. She had always preferred to let her work speak for itself, and the thought of becoming a public figure in such a painful context made her uneasy. But after much deliberation, she decided to speak out. If my voice can help prevent this from happening to someone else, she reasoned, then it's worth it. Naomi's first interview aired on a popular local news station. Sitting across from the anchor in the brightly lit studio, she recounted the events of that morning with clarity and composure. She spoke not just about the physical and emotional toll of the attack but about the broader issue of systemic racism and the countless individuals who suffered in silence. Her words were powerful, resonating with viewers across the city. By the time she returned home that evening, her phone was buzzing non-stop. Texts, emails, and social media notifications poured in. Many were messages of encouragement, but there were also hateful comments, reminders of the prejudice she was fighting against. Naomi chose to focus on the positive, drawing strength from the support of those who stood with her. Meanwhile, the investigation into the bus driver's actions moved forward. Carla, the transit authority investigator, had assured Naomi that they were taking the case seriously. Witnesses were being interviewed, and additional evidence was being reviewed. Still, the process was slow, and the uncertainty weighed on Naomi. One afternoon, Carla called Naomi with an update. "Dr. Carter," she began, "we've identified several passengers from the bus who might be willing to provide statements. Unfortunately, some are hesitant to get involved. I wanted to ask if you'd be comfortable participating in a mediation meeting with the driver. It could help move the process along." Naomi's stomach churned at the thought of facing the man who had humiliated and assaulted her. The idea of sitting in a room with him, forced to relive the trauma, was almost too much to bear. But she knew this wasn't just about her. This was a chance to hold him accountable, to ensure he understood the gravity of his actions. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "When and where?" The mediation meeting was scheduled for the following week. Naomi prepared herself as best she could, speaking with her lawyer and leaning on her support network. Dr. Patel and a few other colleagues even offered to accompany her, but she declined. "This is something I need to face on my own," she told them. On the day of the meeting, Naomi arrived at the Transit Authority's headquarters, her heart pounding in her chest. She was escorted to a small conference room, where Carla and a mediator were already waiting. A pitcher of water and a stack of notepads sat on the table, an attempt to create a neutral atmosphere. But the tension in the air was palpable. A few minutes later, the door opened, and the driver walked in. Harris looked much the same as he had that morning, gruff and unrepentant. He avoided Naomi's gaze as he took a seat across from her. The mediator began by outlining the purpose of the meeting and setting ground rules. "We're here to have an honest and respectful conversation," she said. "This is an opportunity to address the incident and find a path forward." Naomi listened, her hands clenched in her lap. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath and recounted her experience. She described the fear, the pain, and the humiliation she had felt that day, her voice unwavering despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. When she finished, the room fell silent. Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. Finally, the mediator turned to him. "Mr. Harris, do you have anything you'd like to say?" He scoffed, crossing his arms. "This is all being blown out of proportion," he muttered. "I didn't do anything wrong. She's just making a big deal out of nothing." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue. The mediator pressed him further, but his responses were dismissive and defiant. It was clear he felt no remorse. After the meeting, Carla pulled Naomi aside. "I'm sorry that wasn't more productive," she said. "But your courage in confronting him speaks volumes. This will be reflected in our final report." Naomi nodded, though the encounter had left her drained. As she walked out of the building, she felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Harris's lack of accountability only strengthened her determination to see this through. In the weeks that followed, Naomi's story continued to spark conversations throughout the city. Advocacy groups reached out, offering support and resources. Naomi began attending community meetings, sharing her experience and listening to others who had faced similar struggles. She found solace in the collective resilience of those around her, their stories fueling her fight for justice. The Transit Authority's investigation eventually concluded, and Carla called Naomi with the results. Harris had been found in violation of multiple policies and was terminated from his position. The news brought a sense of closure, but Naomi knew her work wasn't finished. She decided to channel her experience into advocacy, partnering with local organizations to address systemic racism in public transportation. Through her efforts, the city implemented new training programs for transit employees, aiming to prevent incidents like hers from happening again. Naomi had turned her pain into progress, proving once again that resilience could triumph over injustice. Her journey was far from over, but she faced the future with renewed strength and purpose. Uniting voices. The termination of Harris was a step forward, but Naomi understood it wasn't the end. Her encounter with the bus driver had unearthed a deeper issue, one she could no longer ignore. Stories began to reach her, shared by others who had faced similar discrimination on public transportation. The experiences varied in severity, but the common thread was the same, a system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable passengers. Naomi decided to take action. She began organizing a community forum to address these issues, working with local advocacy groups and city officials. Her goal was clear: to create a space where people could share their stories and demand systemic change. The forum was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at a community center in the heart of the city. Naomi spent weeks preparing, meeting with volunteers and spreading the word. Flyers were posted in libraries, coffee shops, and transit stations, while local news outlets covered the upcoming event. On the day of the forum, Naomi arrived early to set up. The room was modest but welcoming, with rows of folding chairs facing a small stage. A projector displayed the event's title on the wall, Voices for Equity, a call for change in public transportation. As the clock ticked closer to the start time, people began to trickle in. By the time the event began, the room was packed. Naomi took a deep breath as she stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the crowd, seeing faces of all ages and backgrounds, united by a shared desire for justice. "Thank you all for being here," Naomi began, her voice steady. "Today, we're not just sharing our stories. We're taking the first step toward meaningful change." The audience applauded, and Naomi felt a surge of confidence. She introduced the first speaker, a young man named Eric, who recounted his experience of being verbally harassed by a bus driver while commuting to work. His voice trembled at first, but as he continued, his words grew stronger. The room listened intently, some nodding in recognition of his pain. Next came Maria, an elderly woman who spoke of being ignored by bus drivers who refused to lower the wheelchair ramp for her. Her story drew gasps of disbelief and murmurs of outrage. One by one, more people came forward. A teenager shared how he had been kicked off a bus for questioning a driver's racial slurs. A mother described how her child had been reduced to tears by a driver's callous comments. Each story painted a vivid picture of a broken system, and each voice added to the growing demand for accountability. When it was Naomi's turn to speak, she took the stage once more. This time, her words carried the weight of collective experience. "What happened to me on that bus was not an isolated incident," she said. "It's part of a larger pattern, one that affects too many people in our community. But today, we've shown that we are not powerless. By sharing our stories, we're shining a light on the injustices that have been allowed to persist for far too long." The room erupted in applause, and Naomi felt a wave of hope wash over her. She outlined the next steps, drafting a list of demands for the transit authority, including mandatory anti-discrimination training for drivers, an improved complaint process, and regular audits to ensure compliance. Over the following weeks, the momentum from the forum continued to grow. The stories shared that day sparked a broader conversation throughout the city. Local media highlighted the event, amplifying the voices of those who had spoken. Advocacy groups joined forces, pooling resources and expertise to push for change. Naomi found herself busier than ever. In addition to her work at the hospital, she attended meetings, wrote proposals, and collaborated with community leaders. The work was exhausting, but it was also deeply fulfilling. For the first time since the incident, Naomi felt like she was reclaiming her power. One day, she received an email from Carla, the investigator who had handled her case. Carla had been following the developments and wanted to offer her support. "I've been inspired by everything you've accomplished," the email read. "If there's any way I can help, please let me know." Naomi replied immediately, thanking Carla and inviting her to join the coalition that had formed after the forum. To her delight, Carla accepted. Her insider knowledge of the transit authority proved invaluable, helping the group refine their proposals and navigate bureaucratic hurdles. The coalition's efforts culminated in a formal meeting with the city's transit board. Naomi stood at the head of the room, flanked by members of the coalition. They presented their demands with confidence, backed by data and personal testimonies. The board members listened, some nodding in agreement, others scribbling notes. When the presentation ended, the board chair thanked them and promised to review their proposals. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a step in the right direction. As they left the meeting, Naomi's colleagues congratulated her on a job well done. Dr. Patel had attended as a show of support, and he clapped her on the shoulder. "You're making a real difference, Naomi," he said. "I'm proud of you." Naomi smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you. But this is just the beginning." Later that evening, Naomi returned home and collapsed onto her couch, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. But despite her fatigue, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Her fight for justice had grown into something larger than herself, and she was determined to see it through. As she drifted off to sleep, Naomi thought about the people she had met, the stories she had heard, and the progress they had made together. The road ahead would be long, but she knew they were moving in the right direction. And for the first time in weeks, Naomi slept soundly, her dreams filled with hope. Momentum builds. Weeks turned into months, and Naomi's fight for justice became a full-blown movement. The coalition she had helped form grew larger, encompassing people from all walks of life. From activists to local politicians, from everyday commuters to city employees, the effort to reform public transportation in the city began to take on a life of its own. The transit board's review process took longer than Naomi had anticipated, and the waiting was nerve-wracking. But she and her team didn't let that slow them down. They hosted workshops, created educational materials, and pushed awareness campaigns across the city. The movement's slogan, "Equal Transit for All," became a rallying cry, plastered on banners, posters, and social media posts. Naomi also began receiving invitations to speak at colleges, town halls, and other community events. She shared her story with honesty and grace, always emphasizing the collective strength of those who had joined the fight. Her speeches resonated deeply, and more people were inspired to step forward with their own stories. During one such event at a local university, Naomi spoke to a packed auditorium. Students, faculty, and city residents filled the room, their faces reflecting a mix of anger, hope, and determination. "Change doesn't come easily," Naomi said, her voice steady. "But it starts with a single action, a single voice refusing to stay silent. Together, we are that voice. Together, we can create a city where no one has to fear discrimination on their way to work, school, or anywhere else." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of energy that filled the room. After the event, students lined up to thank Naomi personally. One young woman, a law student named Anika, handed Naomi a small envelope. "This is for the coalition," Anika said. "It's not much, but I hope it helps." Naomi opened the envelope to find a donation and a heartfelt note. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she thanked Anika. Every gesture of support, no matter how small, reminded her why she had started this fight in the first place. Meanwhile, the transit authority faced mounting pressure. The public outcry, fueled by media coverage and community activism, forced them to take a hard look at their policies and practices. Carla, the investigator who had become a trusted ally, kept Naomi updated on the internal deliberations. "The board is seriously considering the coalition's proposals," Carla told her during a phone call. "There's resistance, of course, but they know they can't ignore this any longer. The public is watching. The coalition's proposals included mandatory anti-discrimination training for all transit employees, an overhaul of the complaint process to ensure accountability, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to monitor compliance. Naomi knew these changes wouldn't solve every problem overnight, but they were critical first steps. One evening, Naomi received an unexpected phone call. It was from Eric, the young man who had spoken at the forum months earlier. His voice was filled with excitement. "Naomi, I just wanted to thank you," he said. "Because of the work you've done, I feel like I finally have a voice. I've started volunteering with a local advocacy group, and it's been life-changing. You inspired me to take action." Naomi's heart swelled with pride. Moments like this reminded her that the movement wasn't just about policies and procedures, it was about empowering people to stand up for themselves and each other. As the months went on, the coalition's efforts began to bear fruit. The Transit Board announced that they would be implementing several of the proposed changes, starting with the anti-discrimination training. It was a victory, but Naomi and her team knew there was still much work to be done. To celebrate their progress and keep the momentum going, the coalition organized a citywide rally. The event, held in the downtown square, drew thousands of attendees. The atmosphere was electric, with live music, speeches, and booths from various community organizations. Naomi stood on the main stage, looking out at the sea of faces. She felt a mix of awe and gratitude. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. As she stepped up to the microphone, the crowd quieted, their attention fixed on her. "When I first decided to speak out," Naomi began, "I didn't know what to expect. I was scared, unsure if my voice would even be heard. But what I've learned is that one voice can become many. One story can ignite a movement. And together, we can achieve what once seemed impossible." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause echoing through the square. Naomi's heart swelled with hope. The journey had been difficult, but it was far from over. She knew the fight for justice would continue, but she also knew she wasn't alone. As the rally ended and people began to disperse, Naomi stood on the stage, taking it all in. The faces of the crowd, the sound of their voices, and the energy in the air filled her with renewed determination. This was more than a movement. This was a revolution. And Naomi was ready to see it through to the end.